you're not alone if you haven't heard of him. I hadn't heard of him either. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got interested in him. Oh yeah, lights. Lights.
Is that good? Everybody one light back. Is that okay?
Can you turn these off, maybe? Can you see the screen okay? Okay.
Oh, there you go.
All right.
Perfect.
So I think it's better.
I'm just pressing buttons.
Yeah, it was better to have the ones on back there and this one off, but if you can't, it's fine. I live in Oberlin, Ohio, and I had never heard of this guy. But once I started looking into him, I became really interested and I fell down a rabbit hole. It's not advancing my slide.
Uh-oh. There we go.
We go. Okay. So the first time I heard about Lynds Jones was in a blog post on Facebook, or a meme by Ken Kaufman, who's the birding author and Black Swamp Bird Observatory. He posted that these two men in 1898 conducted the first, this was the first time anybody had seen more than 100 species in a single day. And I thought, well, that's cool. And then I read about where they started from. You know, this could have been anywhere in the US, but it happened to be in Oberlin in Lorain County, which is where I live. And I still have yet to tally over 100 species myself. Like my kids and I, every year we try. Last year, I think we got to 98. We're getting there. So I thought, I got to find out more about these people. I'll go to the library. I'll get the book. Well, there was no book. So then I was, okay, how do I find out more? And there was a blog post by a birder who wrote very thoughtfully about Lynds Jones's contributions to birding, which I will tell you about. But then I went to the archives at Oberlin College, since I lived there, and I found a whole bunch more material that made me even more interested and excited about telling the story. So he had left an important legacy to recreational birding, which is why we're here. Birding as a hobby didn't exist in the 19th century. If anybody was looking at birds, they were usually collecting them. He did, as I mentioned, the first big day. He also is responsible for the Christmas bird count, even though he's not ever given credit for it. And he was perhaps the first lister. He was compulsive about keeping lists of birds, where he saw them and when he saw them. And he published them in a journal until the journal was like, why should we take up so much space in our journal with just lists of birds? So they stopped. But now we have eBird, which allows everyone to list our birds, which is also useful for science. He also made major contributions to ornithology. He founded the Wilson Ornithological Society. Oops. This is advancing further than I want. Let's go back to this slide. He taught the first collegiate course in ornithology. He founded the Wilson Ornithological Society and its journal, the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, and he co-authored The Birds of Ohio in 1903. He was also important in the field of ecology. He was one of the pioneers of ecology, which is kind of like people were not that interested in studying organisms in their environment. They were more interested in collecting them and discovering how they were related by looking at taxonomic specimens. But he was a lot more interested in what does the bird do? How does it behave he was fascinated by migration. He kept decades of records of migration. He also had some amazing ecology field trips that I'll tell you about, and he mentored women in ecology in the early 20th century.
Wow.
Start with ornithology. He was born not far from here, passed by Ashtabula on my way here, in January of 1865, which was an important year because it was, of course, the end of the Civil War. His father was a captain in the militia, but his wife said, I don't want you to go fight in the war. You have young children at home. Stay here. So he didn't fight. But then when everyone was coming back from the war, he was kind of embarrassed and didn't want to have to show his face around town. And he moved the entire family to Grinnell, Iowa, which is where Lynds Jones spent the rest of his childhood. His dad wasn't the best farm manager, and all of the kids had to earn money to help support the family. And Lynds learned how to collect eggs. And at that time, there was a huge market in collecting and selling eggs. In order to collect eggs, you have to be extremely observant of bird behavior, as you're going to be doing with the Breeding Bird Atlas. You need to know the habitat, you need to know where they lay their eggs, and you need to know when they lay their eggs, because you want to collect them when they're fresh, not when they have embryos in them. By the time he left Grinnell, he had amassed a collection of 250 species of birds. Not all of which he collected, but he also traded with other collectors. This is a clutch of alder flycatcher eggs that he collected in Lorain County, Ohio. As far as I know, alder flycatcher doesn't breed in Lorain County anymore. This collection ended up at Ohio State. Make sure this is the next slide. Yes, okay. So, do you know the name Louis Agassiz? Okay, so he was a natural history pioneer, but also he was an opponent of Charles Darwin. He didn't believe in the theory of evolution, he believed in the theory of creation, and he also held now very much disparate views on race and hierarchy. But in 1875, he had just died, and a young man from Ohio wanted to honor his legacy by teaching young people about natural history. So he founded this organization called the Agassiz Association. It's nationwide, and they had chapters. It's sort of like scouting, where you would have a chapter local to your geographic area. And in Grinnell, Lynds Jones's high school teacher agreed to sponsor a chapter. So it was basically Lynds Jones and his brothers and sisters, and George Tallman, the advisor, and his kids, and then a couple other neighboring families. And they put out this newspaper of natural history. I found this in the Oberlin College archives. It's like tabloid size, handwritten, page after page after page after page. I don't know if they ever produced more than one copy, but even one copy was pretty laborious. And they also had a natural history collection that Lynds was the curator of. And everyone in the club kind of took an area of interest in natural history, and Lynds was, of course, interested in birds. And he would publish articles on birds, and I didn't include any one of the articles, but you can kind of get a sense. In 1887, this is the first issue in which Lynds Jones appears as an editor. And you'll see why this is important, but he basically was an editor for the rest of his life, or at least until he retired. It was a passion and a profession. Lynds sent his records on bird migration to the U.S. Geological Survey and the American Ornithological Union. And this is a journal that the Agassiz Association published nationwide called Swiss Cross. And this was a little entry from the chapter 887 Grinnell. And they celebrated Agassiz's birthday. They have been, we have derived great benefit from writing notes on our observation for scientific papers and would advise all Agassiz Association members follow this practice. So he's not only editing, he's also encouraging other people to publish. So, as I said, the early Agassiz Association, the chapters were all geographically based. But younger people living in the West who were interested in ornithology felt they weren't given much attention from the American Ornithological Union, formed their own chapter of the Agassiz Association that was interest-based rather than geographically based. And in fact, they didn't even have an in-person meeting until sometime in the 1910s. And so they were all corresponding through this journal that they founded. It started as the ornithologists and oologists semi-annual. So that's the oologists are the egg collectors. They eventually started publishing, and I just saw the other day that early publications are like 3.5 by 5 size. They're tiny. And they were experimenting with fonts and things. They eventually got reprinted in what's now called the Wilson Bulletin, but they're at like normal size. So I thought it was fun to see the tiny little ones. When you only have 11 members or 15 members, sometimes you have to wear a lot of hats. So Lynds Jones was elected president that year in 1890. He also tabulated the votes for the election as the secretary. He was the acting treasurer. He also wrote the incoming president's address, and he published the bulletin. This keeps advancing way more than I wanted to. He was president, secretary, treasurer, and editor, sometimes concurrently. He was editor for 35 years. That was the position he held the longest. So how did he come to Oberlin from Grinnell? He studied for a couple of years at Grinnell College, but his aunt, Mary Shirtliff, who was his mother's sister, was married to a man who was a general in the Civil War and was then treasurer of Oberlin College. And she said, hey, I know you're interested in natural history. Grinnell has a more classical curriculum. You should think about coming to Oberlin where you could study more science. So that's what he did. He transferred and graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1892. And his first job was curator of the college's Natural History Museum, which was quite extensive at the time. He married Clara Tallman, who was another Agassiz Association member, the daughter of their advisor, in 1892, and brought her to Oberlin. When he graduated, he asked to teach ornithology, but college denied his request, saying it's not worthy of serious study in college level. He asked to offer it on a trial basis and was kind of food, but they said, okay, you can charge a laboratory fee and that'll be your salary. The faculty thought that not many students would elect it, but it proved to be the most popular class at the undergraduate level, with 137 students at the largest class size. And they would take daily field trips, like it would be like a lab with a like Lynds Jones didn't go on all of the field trips, but every like Monday at 6 a.m. was lab group A, Tuesday at 6 a.m. was lab group B, etc. And then on Saturdays, he would take the more advanced students on all-day field trips. And then they sometimes rented wagons and went to neighboring towns. One of his students was William Leon Dawson, who is the other person who appeared on that big day. He's a really interesting character, and I wish I knew more about him, but he was a theologian. When he graduated from Oberlin College, he took a parish in Washington State, and they were very close. They continued to correspond throughout their lives, although I have not been able to find any of their letters. He first moved to Washington State, then to California, and his egg collection was the basis of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. He wrote Birds of Ohio, The Birds of Washington, and The Birds of California. He was supposed to be a minister and was for a time, but always went back to birds. In 1900, Dawson invited Jones to come west and to go birding with him. So they traveled first to Lynds went to Pasadena, which is where he had a brother and a sister living by that time. Then he took the train up to Washington State, crossed Lake Chelan by steamboat, hiked in the mountains. On one day, they accidentally left a fire that wasn't completely out, and it smoldered and destroyed all the belongings that they had left back at the campsite, including his return train ticket, which of course by then wasn't good though. Much of his clothing. They had brought arsenic for preserving bird specimens, and it poisoned the food that they had. When they left the mountains, they floated down the Skagit River on a homemade raft because they were tired of hiking. You can see Lynds Jones's boot is a little torn up here. When they got back to civilization and told their story, with people were like, no, they couldn't have happened. I don't believe you. And Lynds, as I said, kept obsessive records of all the birds that he saw, where he saw them. He said that he added the most number to his life list in Los Angeles County. I just recently encountered the journal that Lynds Jones kept on that trip. It was in a drawer in a biology lab at Oberlin College, and when the person whose lab it was found out that I was interested in, he said, like, come and look at all this stuff that I found. And I was flabbergasted because this is the journal of his 1900 West trip. You can't really read it. It says 1900, I think, Western trip. This is the record of birds that he saw July 21st to 26th, 27, 28, 29, and 30th. On one of those days, I haven't figured out which one is the day that they had the fire. So apparently he had this journal with him because it wasn't destroyed. As I said, Dawson and Jones collaborated on the 1903 Birds of Ohio, which is an amazing book if you ever get a chance. It's digitized. You can find it online, or some libraries have it. Oberlin College obviously does. It's 2 volumes, 671 pages, so it's not a field guide that you take. Dawson wrote the descriptions of the species, and Jones kept the catalog, like the breeding bird atlas, of like where birds were seen, when they were seen, and whether they were breeding in the state. Dawson unfortunately died when he was researching the 2nd volume, so that was never published. And the next Birds of Ohio, wrong way. Next Birds of Ohio didn't come out until 1989. Back to this one. So the writing in here is very descriptive, very flowery. What I like about it is the birds are still the same. Like you can recognize the birds that he's writing about, and you could imagine applying the same descriptions. But I think it's beautiful. This is writing about bobolink. There's like 3 pages just on bobolink. This is my favorite part. The males press northward, hot-winged, to riot for a while over the dank meadows and bachelor companies, and to perfect that marvel of tumultuous song. Oh, how they sing, those bacchanals of springtime, from fence post or treetop, quivering in midair, they pour forth such an ecstasy of liquid gurgling notes as must thrill the very clods. Such exuberance of spirit, such reckless abandon of mirth-compelling joy would cure a sick creature on Blue Monday. They dedicated the book to Will Oberlin, Dawson's son, who was at the time, I think, 3 years old. And in the archives, I came across a letter that Lynds Jones wrote to his wife, Clara, in 1920, where Will Dawson has dropped the freshman Bible and come into my bird course, following in his father's footsteps. He said nothing to me about it until the deed was done, so that any lack of knowledge, and so I'm not guilty. I don't know what his father will say. I guess that any lack of knowledge of the Bible on his part due to this change might well be laid to his father's door. And then he writes to Clara about moving the manure piles, because all this time he was a professor at Oberlin College, he was also running a farm. He was a much better manager than his father. He became well known for his corn breeding. Would come to him for his seeds. All right, moving into recreational birding. How many of you have seen The Big Year? Yeah, it's my family's like favorite movie.
Having a little trouble hearing back here.
Oh, okay. Should I move the speaker?
Well, I'm placing it where people at home
Okay.
could also hear it through my computer, so I'm just gonna.
Sense your voice cadence goes down a little bit.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. I'll try to be better about that.
Some of that.
Thank you for pointing that out. So getting to the all day with the birds, the first big day. They documented all the birds they saw or heard on a single day in Lorain County in 1898. And in 1900, Jones became the first person to, on his own, see over 100 species. I found the entry in Jones's diary. It's sort of dry. Dawson and I went out to South Woods, which is south of Oberlin, at 3:15 a.m., stayed till 7:30, came home to breakfast, took 8:30 car, reached Lorain at 9:45, walked over to Oak Point on the beach part of the way, then home across country. Reached home at 8:30 p.m., reported 102 species. So I try to figure out, like, well, how far did they walk? So from Oberlin to the South Woods, it's only about a mile, but they spent like 4 hours there. So I figure that they walked around quite a bit. They took the train up to Elyria, changed for Lorain, and then walked along beach part of the way, 4 miles to Oak Point. Oak Point used to be where Beaver Creek emptied out into Lake Erie. Well, it still is where Beaver Creek empties out, but at the time there was an alluvial fan. Today there's a marina and a power plant and a railroad. So there's no seeing the kinds of birds that they would have seen back then. And then They walked along Beaver Creek and then across the farm fields until they got back to Oberlin. So I figured they walked like 20 miles. I'm not willing to do that for my big day, sorry. So now big days, big weeks, big years are commonplace, and we all know what they are. We talk about them, but now you know where they started. Biggest week is also started in 2009. Who's been to the biggest week? Couple people. All right, it's not that far.
Trying to come forward.
Is that in Toledo?
It is just east of Toledo. It's in headquartered at Maumee Bay State Park. And there's a Maumee Bay right there. There's a hotel. And then they take you out birding on innumerable field trips you can sign up for, or you can just bird on your own in the area. And there are keynote speakers every day and panels, and they have like a tattoo contest and a prom. It's kind of fun.
I think there's another nuclear power plant.
Yes, Davis Bessie. Behind Davis Bessie is a nice, well-preserved marsh. It's not open to the public, but it's where Black Swamp Bird Observatory has a banding station. Now moving on to the Christmas bird count. Do you guys do Christmas bird count here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, very good. So you probably don't know the first Christmas bird count was in Oberlin, Ohio. Wasn't called that, but this was on December 28th, 1897. They called it the winter census, and they circumscribed a radius or a circle on Oberlin, and they tried to count as many birds as they could in that 3/4 of a mile diameter circle. They figure they took the bird census of 2/3 of town within the 3/4 mile limit. They found 16 species and 74 individuals and 10,000 English sparrows,
Wow.
which I think were a bigger problem back then than they even are today.
Single house sparrow?
That's how spread it is. Getting horses and stuff.
So they wrote this up in the Wilson Bulletin and gave a much more lively description of what happened that day. Such little things as high picket and wire fences, thorny hedgerows, inquisitive housekeepers, and threatened incarceration as lunatics are not to be considered. This census taking is given as much attention as the note taking which every lover of birds indulges in during the spring will fill in the usual winter blank. So they were trying to get people out and observing birds in the winter because there was very little data. And like I said, Lynds was interested in birds in their habitat. And at the very end of the article, he says, try it. Part of that same article, he did what he called a Senso Horizon, following the same path that he took on that big day count. So birding the South Woods, taking the trains, walking along the beach and along Beaver Creek. But he said it was a gale and there were the waves on the lake were held back only by these giant mounds of ice, and he had to walk in the lee of Beaver Creek. And he was also encouraging people to do that. It obviously did not catch on quite the same way. In 1900, Frank Chapman, who undoubtedly read the Wilson Bulletin, might have been friends with Lynds Jones, proposed the first National Audubon Christmas bird census on Christmas Day, 1900. Lynds Jones was one of 27 people who took him up on that. and they mailed their reports into bird lore. But Lynds had been doing this every winter since 1897. So this was really the fourth Christmas bird count. We call it the first. In 2024, impressive numbers, 83,000 people, 2,600 count circles, which are now 15 miles in diameter, not 3/4 of a mile, which makes them a lot more challenging to cover. It's throughout the Americas from like far north, there are inhabitants in Canada down to the Drake Passage. And we counted 2,300 species, which is a quarter of the world's known bird species, 43 million birds. But that's half as many birds as were tallied just 50 years ago, which is sobering. Not only because it's so many fewer birds, but also there were fewer count circles back then. There were half as many count circles, half as many people counting, and yet they tallied twice as many birds. Moving on to ecology. I want to introduce you to Althea Sherman. Has anybody heard of Althea Sherman? She's a really interesting person and was the first to document the life cycle of chimney swifts. She built a tower on her farm property with windows that she could look in, stairs that went around the outside so that she could look at what the chimney swifts were doing inside the tower. Until then, nobody had any idea how chimney swifts were nesting. So she's most well known for that. She's one of Oberlin's academic children. She graduated in 1875 with a degree in art. And she taught art until her parents became ill and she had to go back to the family farm and help take care of them with her sister. So she began studying the birds just in the farmyard in the early 1900s. So she's not a trained ornithologist, but she was an extremely perceptive observer. And she also, as an artist, was able to document through her drawings. She frequently corresponded with Lynds Jones. In fact, I found her letters in the archives, and she's fairly famous at Oberlin College, and she has a whole archival section like of her own. But these letters that she wrote to Lynds Jones weren't even indexed in the binding guide, so nobody even knew they were there. I just stumbled across this folder that was unlabeled. She published ornithology articles beginning in 1905. Her first article was some observations at Weedseed Inn, which was for farmyard property. She came to visit Lynds Jones, and they saw each other at academic conferences. As I said, they wrote letters back and forth, and she came to Oberlin College in 1906. And Lynds Jones had just received his PhD from the University of Chicago. And she was afraid that he was going to get a job offer at another university. And she really, really wanted him to stay at Oberlin. He was prepared to accept an offer somewhere else, and in fact sold his house in preparation for moving somewhere should he get an offer. But she urged Oberlin College to endow a professorship in ornithology, for which she provided the seed money of $600. She wrote in this letter in 1907, I hope the subject connected with the welfare of Oberlin College, in which I have been deeply interested, is being satisfactorily settled. That is the endowment. I have tried to do all I can according to the light afforded me. I have urged the matter upon trustees and alumni as I have met with them. All agree with me as to what is best for Oberlin, and I think we shall secure her best interest if you can afford to wait. In April, I visited in Minnesota and Northfield. I found all my friends were studying birds. This means that in a few years, our colleges will give more attention to the study, and Oberlin ought not to lose her leading position in the work being done in that line. Unfortunately, Oberlin didn't listen to her, and they refused the endowment. She tried to lobby everyone from alumni and the trustees to the US Senator from Ohio, which happened to be Lynds Jones' uncle. But the college resisted trying to raise the money. So instead, she said that she would pay his a third of his salary if he would stay at Oberlin, at least for that year. And he became associate professor of animal ecology, which was not a department then, but in a dispute with the department chair of zoology, he was eventually granted his own department of animal ecology, which was the first ecology department anywhere in the United States. He stayed at Oberlin College until he retired at age 65, but they dropped department and courses in ornithology when he retired in 1930. Althea wanted to give a paper at the American Ornithologists Union conference on northern flickers, but she asked Lynds in a letter, could you please read my paper before I give it? Because I'm not a trained ornithologist. I don't know what people know about northern flickers already, so I don't want to be duplicative in the information that I provide. And he said, oh no, this is all new. She had installed nest boxes on the side of her barn, and then she opened the nest boxes by climbing a ladder, taking out the nestlings. She weighed them every day.
Oh, wow.
And so this is her accounts of the broods of flickers of 1908. She published this 40-page paper, or I should say Lynds Jones published her 40-page paper in the Wilson Bulletin in 1910. Following Lynds Jones's desire to visit Western Washington again, or I'm sorry, let me back up. In 1910 to 1914, he offered an ecology summer school on Lake Erie at various places, Point Pelee, Ohio State University Lake Laboratory, Marblehead. But following his desire to visit Western Washington again, he offered a field trip by train to students to go all the way to Washington in 1915. So that summer, they took a 6-week field trip to the West Coast. Every student was encouraged to write a paper and to document their trip. I found the diary and paper and photograph album of Enid Bancroft Sutton in the archives. She was interested in the birds. She wrote about where they went. So they took a train to Seattle, which is Lori somewhere around here. And then they took a steamship all the way up to Neah Bay at the northwestern tip of Washington State. And then they boarded ocean-going canoes with Native Americans as guides. And then they visited these rocky islands where the birds were breeding. She took some amazing photographs. What I found interesting about this photograph in particular was that there are more than twice as many women as men in this field trip group. That's Enid herself. This is the ocean-going canoes as they were leaving Neah Bay. That's the kitchen. So they were camping and fishing on the way. They also traveled by horseback and by foot. A hard landing. Picture fails to show how rough it was. I can imagine.
No.
Then these are It's a California myrrh colony, and they climbed down, got closer to the myrrhs, got even closer to them, and even closer. She's got these basically close-up photos, but she wasn't using like a zoom lens or anything. In fact, this is the kind of camera that she was using. It's a Kodak portable. They probably reached into the burrows to take out the birds they were examining. In this case, a tufted puffin. They took another train trip in 1916, and then World War I intervened. They took a break. And by 1919, Lynds was interested in going to the West Coast again, but this time he wanted to do it by car. Very, very early days of the automobile. This is actually a photograph from 1920. They would take cars they would buy them in Ohio, drive to the West Coast, sell the cars, return by train. So you'll see toward the end of my talk, you'll see about how many Ford automobiles he owned in his lifetime. They bought this 1-ton truck for the 1920 field trip, but it proved to be cumbersome. It was not very reliable, and it was really too heavy for the roads that existed at the time. So that was the last of the 1-ton truck. This is George Jones and Lynds' wife, Clara Tallman. George is famous in Oberlin. He's remembered by people today because he lived until he was 100 years old. Only died in 1998, and he led weekly ecology walks every Sunday afternoon for like decades. And many people I have talked to and given this talk to have come up to me afterwards with stories about their walks with George.
Is he related to them or just?
Yeah, George is their son.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't say that. George himself was a professor at Oberlin College. Also, he was a botanist. And he went on, as far as I can tell, all of the field trips with his father. And he became quite the mechanic. He was the one who was fixing the cars. Fords in particular, at that time, had a spring somewhere in the engine that was weak, and it would break and the car would stop. George figured this out relatively quickly, and so he would keep a pocket full of these springs and just replace them as they went along. I love this picture, which I got just recently from Lynds' great granddaughter, George's granddaughter, Renata Green. They had bumper stickers for them. I mean, that's what you could call them, really. This is another diary kept by Grace Cowling Berlin, was a student. She graduated in 1923. She was one of the first people in Ohio to receive it, the first women in Ohio to receive a degree in animal ecology. When I looked at the yearbook for that year, there were 3 people graduating in Oberlin College's class of 1923 with degrees in animal ecology, and they were all women. She was interested in the vegetation, so she kept this journal of beech maple forest, hickory forest, chaparral, and she chronicled like as they drove. And I guess they must have driven both directions because she's got it going both ways. She wrote a 90-page typewritten report, and it got a B+. I gather he was a hard grader. So with cars, as I mentioned, comes car trouble. They often had several flat tires a day. Most of the Fords had these weed timer springs, and in 1921, Lynds' car, the steering mechanism came uncoupled when he was driving in the mountains. He drove off the side of the mountain. A boulder stopped the car, so they didn't get very far, thankfully. Car and the passengers were in pretty good shape, but they couldn't get out and up the hill. Two of the other cars went by without noticing anything amiss. George was the final car, and he saw these tire tracks going off the side of the road, and so he stopped, fortunately. And the other cars had gotten like miles ahead, and when nobody showed up, they turned around and came back. They were able to winch the car up to the road. They had to get parts shipped by train, but they fixed the car and they got back on the road. So they ran out of gas, they had flat tires, there weren't bridges, they had to ford the rivers. George replacing a connecting rod. When I looked at the pictures that Grace took, the scenery looked exactly the same. I visited these places as well. I didn't do black and white pictures, but this is exactly what that looked like. But the people all look very different. Clothing that they're wearing, the boots, the hats. Again, this year there were a lot of women on this trip. Gladys, Greta, Grace, Louise, and Genevieve. I think George kept lists of who went on all the trips, and I haven't had a chance to go and look at how many women versus men went. But my impression is there was always more women. They had some fun with the seaweed. I don't know what they were doing this Pelican. It's not standard procedure nowadays, fortunately. This is another photograph that Renata gave me where they're fording a river. The only man in this picture is Lynds Jones. All the rest of them are women. One of them, Mary Burwell, married George Jones. So I'm coming to the end of the talk. I want to talk just a little bit about his personal legacy. As I said, I mentioned his son, George. His oldest son, Lynds Leo, was an electrician and died in the same year as his father, so 1951, within 12 months. The next youngest, Theo, was in what sounds like a farming accident and died when he was only 13 years old. Sounds like he hit his head. They call it apoplexy, but that's could be a brain bleed. George, middle child, received his degree in animal ecology from Oberlin and went on to teach there. He got a PhD from the University of Chicago, just like his father, and he studied under Henry Cowles. Is that a familiar name to you? So he's the father of the theory of succession, which you should be very familiar with that here along the lakefront. Beth, the daughter, married another one of Lynds' students who had gone on one of the field trips, named Max the Laubenfels. He was a marine biologist. He became a world-renowned expert on sponges, so you could call him a spongiologist. Their son, David de Laubenfels, became an expert on the taxonomy of conifers. So this family, it's like everyone takes a deep dive into their passion. Harold Charles, the youngest, became a biology professor. He was shot in an accident by his older brother, Lynds, when he was about 3, and they worried that he was ever going to be okay, but he became a professor, so everything was fine in the end. George had 3 children, 2 daughters, Susan and Margaret, and a son also named Lynds, who unfortunately, when he was a college student, at age 20, died in a forestry accident in the same year that his father and his uncle Lynds also died. So there were no Lynds Joneses in the line of succession. Renata Green, granddaughter, had a son that she named Lynds. So he's the 5th generation. And he changed his name to Jones so that he could graduate from college as Lynds Jones. So here is Renata and Johanna, two of George's daughters. So Renata told me an interesting tidbit in the journey of my mother getting rid of stuff. I don't know if I told you about when my mother broke up the house to get ready to sell. Her church friend advised her that it would cause fights if allowed to be there for the estate sale. So we were banned and she sold away family treasures. I got 2 boxes of pictures that the Millers who lived next door rescued and gave to me. So those are some of the pictures that she had shared with me. I am grateful to Jones Family Archives at Oberlin College. This wonderful blog post, the most influential birder most of us have never heard of, who got me started in his recreational birding legacy. And this was his 54th Ford car, 1936, but that wasn't his last. Renata gave me this picture too. The last car he owned was in 1946, so I don't know how many there were in between. There could have been 10 more. And I have one more talk scheduled. If you have any friends in the Cleveland area, I'd be happy to have them join me on Friday, April 17th. Any questions?
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Questions plural. One is I've heard of egg collecting, but what exactly were they doing with those eggs? Just emptying them out, preserving, and putting in a drawer, or was there more to that?
So I gather there was a market for it. You know, people collected feathers also for costumes, but also and birds as specimens as I don't know, it was like the age of collecting things. And the only reason we don't do that now is because of the International Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so most of the eggs that are in ornithological collections in museums were collected before 1918, unless somebody had a special permit to collect.
And so they would take the entire clutch.
They would take the whole clutch, yeah.
And my other question was, and I don't know if this is something you have researched. So the courses at Oberlin College that they would offer and that not offer and that cancel, and what those weren't part of any required curriculum. They were just electives.
Correct.
And so those students then they would graduate with what kind of all kinds of degrees?
Well, I guess in Lynds Jones's time, it would have been zoology and then or animal ecology. Nowadays, they do teach ornithology. It would be biology students, or they do have, it's not called ecology, but environmental studies, I think, is the department today.
But back then it was just an elective.
Back then, it was just an elective, yeah. So with the egg clutches, the hope was
They would
if they lose the whole clutch, they would lay again.
which may or may not happen, right?
Which may or may not happen. But I saw in his diary one day, this was back when he was still in Grinnell, discovered great horned owl nest with 1 egg. So you can imagine, great horned owl nest somewhere high in a tree. Climbed up, looked in, saw 1 egg, left it alone.
Oh.
Returned 3 days later, collected the clutch of 3 eggs.
Yeah.
Lucky he didn't get conked on the head by Mama Owl.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Other questions?
Not
Okay.
a question, but a comment. It must have been so much fun to go on those trips.
Oh, I know.
And they would see, I don't want to say an unspoiled land, but so much, there were so many more birds back then to see.
So many.
Nowadays.
So many more of everything. I forgot to mention that Lynds's brother Marcus was a world-renowned botanist who lived in Salt Lake City. So when they did those car trips, you could see that, that the lines crossed, so they went out and back through Salt Lake City. They picked up and dropped off marks. I know.
Just can't.
Me as well. I was surprised there were any women, frankly.
Many obstacles. So many obstacles to birding in those days, I was saying.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions, I just wanted to announce that we are going to go from a very local, next door sort of theme to our next month's presentation is going to be virtual because the presenter is going to be exactly on the opposite side of the globe. So as many of you may remember, when Chris and I went to Armenia, we came back and gave you a report and there were so many questions and follow-up and so much sort of interest in that now we have the lead ornithologist of Armenia talk to us, but he's not coming over. It's about what, 5,000 miles or so. So, I think our travel fee will cover that. So we're gonna have it virtual, but tune in if you can. It's gonna be
And
fun.
he's gonna talk
We do
about
have a question
conservation.
Came in on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, someone would like to know, do you believe there are more documents at Oberlin to find?
Oh, absolutely. There's like many feet of space in the archives devoted to the Jones family. In fact, George was an obsessive documenter of his own life. Despite the fact that his father edited and published a journal, George never published a scientific paper in his entire life. He collected botanical specimens, but he wrote everything down, and he wrote an 800-page biography of his father based on his father's diary entries, like I showed you. I've looked at part of that, but it's like not even broken down by year. It's just like continuous stream of like, and I was trying to look for when did he meet Althea Sherman? And it was without AI, and I haven't scanned it in, like it was hard to just find the interesting tidbits of information. Because often it was just about the manure piles. But George also wrote a 4,000-page autobiography, which, if you were to publish that, would fill 18 volumes of a normal book. So I haven't read that yet. But yeah, there's tons of letters. They wrote letters. They had like a circular letter they would write to their brother, and then the brother would send it to their niece, and the niece would send it to the cousin, and it would go like in a round robin, and they just keep it going, adding on to it. So there's lots of material.
So your next project, 18 volumes of autobiography?
I don't know if I'm ready to tackle that, but I did. The archivist came to my last talk, and I told him now that I've retired that I plan to show back up in the archives. He said, "We welcome you anytime."
Any other questions?
Opposite group questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention.